Tell us who you are.
I'm Kris Ambler. I'm the workforce lead at the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, BACP, and we're the largest professional association in the UK for counsellors and psychotherapists. And I work in the policy and public affairs team. My remit is to, as a workforce lead, is to raise the profile of workplace counselling and its effectiveness in particular, to campaign for a greater investment. So a lot of the work I do is with parliamentarians and sort of leaders and so on. I also do a lot of work at industry level with industries where there's a greater demand for workplace counselling and psychotherapy. And that tends to be industries where there are higher levels of suicide, occupational stress and those kinds of issues. So I've done lots of work in the retail, agriculture, farming, logistics and transport, and the construction industry. So lots of work with bodies in and around there. And I tend to work with lots of the sort of organisations that are here today. So they can be providers like CareCoins. They can be organisations that represent businesses in some way like ACAS or CBI and those as well. So really broad sort of stakeholders. I also lead our work on wellbeing internally at the BACP. So I've just finished the wellbeing strategy, just written our new iteration of that, and I chair our internal wellbeing group. So we very much practice what we preach, and spend a lot of time going out and talking to organisations and appearing at conferences to talk about some of the contemporary issues in workplaces, like AI, the advent of artificial intelligence. What does that mean for our members, for therapists? Are we all going to be replaced by bots?
Are we?
No, not yet. No.
It's funny. No, I don't think so.
I don't think
we
so.
were having a conversation just before. I went to a conference a couple of weeks ago and they did a Turing test at the front of the room. So where we had to tell whether it was a human answering the questions or the robot or the AI. And you near enough couldn't tell the difference. And I thought, as this improves, I don't know, a bit of a left turn. But what do you think the role of AI is in?
Well, it's interesting.
Therapy.
Well, it's got an important role to play. I mean, this is a topic that I'm speaking about this afternoon, actually, in a couple of sessions around AI. So I've had time to prepare. It can play, I mean, it already is playing a role. I mean, that's something to say as well, that I think there's a lot of fear-based narrative about AI and it coming and taking our roles and things. But I think it's important to say that currently, and I don't see this changing in the future, that where AI is being used successfully, and it is already being used in the NHS, it's very much alongside, it's part of an ecosystem of support. So it might be in the early diagnostics and so on. Some apps can provide a sort of low intensity type of support, CBT and that sort of things. But if you pick out your phone and show me the amount of apps you've got in there now, we've all got apps that we sign up to and then never use. And that's one of the things with AI as well. Remember that effectively relies on constant human interaction. And research shows that, I think only 3 in 5 people or something like that stick with apps once they download them. So that's an awful lot of people that won't use those kinds of apps. And I mean, there's sort of wellness apps that we've seen. There are lots. I'm not going to name check any of them, give them some free advertising, but we've seen a lot of proliferation of those lately. But for more intense type therapy, that face-to-face, human, empathic component is absolutely essential. And I mean, I think it's important to note the limitations as well of AI. It's still data-driven, it's generative. They are limited because of that, and potentially there are issues as well of people becoming sort of dependent on apps. So we've seen.
I feel like ChatGPT is making me stupider. Have I told you this? I feel like every time I try and think of something, I'm like, just ChatGPT it, and I'm genuinely worried that I'm forgetting to have original thoughts.
Well, and you think about that in terms of your own well-being, then, and there's that whole thing around building your sort of personal resilience, building that sort of that ability to cope with an increasingly demanding, complex world. If you think about the challenges we've all faced over the last 4 or 5 years, and they're not hitting everybody in the same way. There are some groups in society that have been harder hit, have experienced greater hardship because of the struggles we're seeing in the world, conflict, climate change, COVID-19 pandemic, which we're still living the legacy impacts of that, the cost of living crisis. all of these things are creating a very complex, difficult sort of world for us to navigate. And again, young people in particular, who are quite often the target markets, I suppose, millennials for tech, because they're raised with it, they don't have a life without it. There's a real risk, I suppose, that they become. That's again, I think there was research recently that showed that around 40% of people that are using apps are doing outside of normal office hours, which again is an attractive benefit of them, because you can access them when you like, but that very quickly can become dependency, and that isn't good, because again there's an argument that says that you almost have to learn to sit with discomfort. That's how you build that sort of resilience and those coping mechanisms, those coping skills. So we have to be careful about that as well. I mean, there was a really there's lots, if you look in the media, of examples of where AI has failed, and there was one which it was relatively famous recently, and it was because the people that were using this particular AI platform, it effectively what it is, it replaced the need for human contact, and largely men were using this, and they were creating, avatars, a sort of a new erotic partner, and that wasn't the intention of the developers, and it quickly became, because it's a case of sort of garbage in, garbage out. So the system, because it's generative, will learn from what it's been put in. Now, if your input, source material is lonely men who find it difficult perhaps to engage with people in everyday life and find a romantic partner, that will definitely skew the route that the AI goes on in terms of its development. And what they did was they said, well, this wasn't what we intended, so they pulled it, and they pulled the plug. The fallout from that was huge, and you had people that had developed meaningful, for them anyway, relationships that resulted in feelings of loss, grief, and so on, very real human emotions, when they'd effectively just pulled the plug on what is essentially just a very, very intelligent appliance. It's no different really from your toaster or your television and something like that.
Well, that's the kind of like Black Mirror, the stuff that we were seeing 10 years ago, wasn't it? Like, what if we end up in this situation where we're having these false relationships? Just like sends us all into
Although I would miss my toaster as well.
I would.
Devastated. No.
Yeah.
Can I jump straight to a question around the stigma that has existed, particularly in British culture, around engaging in psychotherapy and having a therapist and counselling and seeing a shrink, the lingo that we see in films from America. Like, how's that these days when you're having these conversations with large organisations, big stakeholders in this space? Like, are we seeing progress?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I think back to 6 years ago when I joined the BACP, and I went to the Health and Wellbeing at Work conference there, and just in the time since, and there have been lots of things I think that have really accelerated the demand and need for mental health support at work, and the COVID-19 pandemic, a huge driver of that. So I think we were always heading in this direction. And if you look at workplace sickness absence, there's been a huge amount of that, which is mental health related, over the last 10 years has grown year on year. What that was a real turning point in sort of accelerating both the need to understand it better, but also ensure that we're putting in place the right sort of support. So now we see a lot more about, rather than having to convince, I suppose, C-suite and businesses about the importance of investing in mental health at work. We still have to do that. We still have to improve the evidence base for investment. Although, recent reports from Business in the Community and every year from Deloitte demonstrate the value of investing in health and wellbeing at work. There's still work to do in that respect, but it's a much easier conversation. And I think we've normalised conversations about psychotherapy and counselling as well. I think there is still some work to do in terms of achieving parity of esteem with other professionals, because when we talk about psychological well-being, quite often we think about psychologists, and my background's occupational psychology, for example, or occupational therapists of one type or another. And it's important to recognise that workplace counselling, as a very discrete, specialised type of counselling, is is a thing in its own right, and it has its place in that sort of landscape, I suppose, the broader landscape of interventions. So it's a much easier sell, it's a much easier conversation to have now. More people are aware of it. And I think more people now, and influencers, and I'm talking about influencers, I don't mean TikTok, I mean, leaders, managers, commissioners increasingly have experiences themselves. I think we're all better at communicating and talking about, particularly men, about our issues, our mental health issues. And I've worked in industries where they are very male dominant. Hence, my work in construction and farming, where 2 farmers a week died by suicide in the UK. Construction again is one of those industries where the suicide rates are hugely disproportionate to the sort of the national averages. And quite often these are in male workforces, where it's difficult conversations about mental health have always been challenging. But we've seen the needle move on those now as well. And we've seen, services working in that space that provide, dedicated, focused support. And I think that's the thing as well, is that we've now recognised that the one-size-fits-all sort of approach doesn't work. We won't get that return on our investment if we do that. If we say, look, we've got an EAP, go and see the EAP. Yeah, we need to be, I mean, the difference between an EAP, for example, that works and an EAP that doesn't work, amongst many things, is its promotion. Somebody needs to keep, talking to people and saying it's there, use it, People won't unless they have people who they can role model. Yeah, so I think that's important as well, because we're talking often about cultural shift there. But if leaders in agriculture, in construction, in the rail industry, where I've done a lot of work recently, are able to talk, through platforms like this, for example, about their experience of mental health, other people and employees will say, actually, maybe we can do that too. And that's what we're seeing, a real shift in that respect. So that's, and of course, the growing market for, wellbeing, which again presents issues as well as opportunities, is evidence, I think, of growth in the sort of understanding of our need for, mental health support in organisations.
Yeah, the EAP is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because there's I don't know whether you felt this, but there's been a bit of a backlash against them just recently, because they have, and it's probably true, become a bit of a tick box exercise in certain businesses. We've got our EAP, therefore we've done wellbeing, and as you say, that's useless without the infrastructure and the support that sits around it, and the role modelling that sits around it. But
I think there's also a need for in organisations, like kind of gateway activities to get people to the EAP. So a lot of what you see in the kind of mental health community sphere, like men's sheds and ways of, like, particularly if we talk about the gendered stuff and the way that men seek help and things, and they're less of a tendency to sit and have a conversation with a friend. They might need activities that help them get to the point where they acknowledge that talking helps, and then perhaps that's then the step into actually accessing the EAP and engaging in a more formal talking therapy. But workplaces aren't often doing that middle bit. Like we've done a little bit of work with sort of women's circles and things like that. We need more of that. More of that generally, so that people are coming together talking about experiences at a low level, informal way, so that then they see and experience the benefit.
Is there something on the EAP providers to bridge that gap as well?
Well, it would be smart from a marketing point of view, wouldn't it?
As well as the employers, Because I've said the line for years, going back over 10 years, where I've said, you should be accessing, if I'm working with a group, you can access an EAP preventatively. It does not need to be something you access when you're on a point of crisis. It can be, just had a really hard week at work. I just want to share something with somebody,
I think that's a really important point, actually. And that relates to therapy as well, because we always see these things from a sort of a crisis level sort of, and typically people only go and access services like mental health services, debt advice services, when it's almost too late. They've hit a crisis point of some kind, and that's a really key message, actually, that it's important to decompress. It's important to have conversations. I mean, if you're part of a crew that has to go out to the aftermath of a suicide, for example, on the rail network, you're seeing really challenging, really difficult things. And there are networks, informal networks at work, because, I mean, it's not true to say that men don't talk about mental health. They do. They just do it differently, and you need that space, I suppose. You need to understand first that people in organisations are all different. They need different nuanced approaches. And if you look across well-being, it's the psychological, the physical, the social, and the financial. If you're doing things across those 4 pillars within an organisation, generally you're providing a more holistic sort of ecosystem of support, because the 4 are connected. If you're a shift worker, for example, working in a manufacturing environment, and there's a huge rush, it's a busy time of the year, pre-Christmas for lots of organisations, you're doing twice as many hours, you're working shifts, which already plays havoc with your body clock and your circadian rhythms, you're not going to be able to access services that typically are open 9 till 5. You're not going to be able to access social clubs and things like that operate in work hours. So you need to think about what you can be providing outside of or alongside the demands and requirements of the role. So that, again, I think there is a greater understanding of the need of a more nuanced, sort of unique type of provision, which can sit alongside, your EAP. Because, again, if an EAP is, well promoted, if their services they provide, in particular the counselling, psychotherapy they're providing, is, accredited. So we accredit counselling services as well as an organisation, or that part of the EAP certainly. Then there's no reason it can't have the impact, but it can't do everything. I think there's a perception, almost an unfair perception, that EAPs are the sort of, and they set out to be the catch-all. They're not. And what they're finding now, and I think what many people are finding, is that, and many service providers are finding, is that increasingly people are coming with more and more complex issues, which they're not geared up. A 6 to 12, counselling session model is not there for high intensity work. And you're talking about people who have, again, problems across all of those different elements of well-being. So it might be people who are struggling financially because of cost of living crisis. That will put an impact on your relationships. It'll impact you physically because you won't be sleeping well. You'll have, stomach problems. Your immune system goes to pot, so you're more likely to be picking up bugs and so on. So you're affected right across the piece, and that, alongside stress, which can quite easily become, anxiety, depression, something more serious. EAPs weren't geared up for that. That's not what they're initially there for. So I think it's about understanding that, and understanding that, maybe we do need to go a little bit further as organisations, because we have, as well as that, there's a really strong economic, argument to say that if you're supporting people across a range of different challenges in their life, the benefits are huge in terms of return on that investment. So I mean, that's what I'd say. I mean, yes, we've seen a huge amount of interest in events like this today, and the work that you guys do really, help to promote and raise awareness. And I think as a society, perhaps, I'd like to think that we're becoming more psychologically literate, so that those conversations are a little less sort of cliche and embedded in those narratives about, and we've all seen them, sort of teen sympathy and things like that. And actually, they can really be life-saving conversations quite often, and really, change people's lives for the better. Yeah.
Well, there's a kind of a need for us to, as employers, or, just for ourselves, like to look at the life cycle of things, whether you're moving through, early parenthood, or raising children, divorce, all the different things that come up. Like it's a constant journey, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And well-being isn't like this. So it's remembering that this is a tool to help support us through all of that. And
that's it, yeah. And we don't stop being the people we are when we walk through the door at work.
Yes.
We spend a huge amount of our life at work. And if you want the best out of people, and you want the best people, you've got to show, and increasingly people, you know, who are joining organisations, one of the top things they join organisations for is those benefits, that package, and that, you know, that really important stuff about walking the walk. You know, yes, we've got a wellbeing strategy. Yes, you know, we're committed to corporate social responsibility and so on. But how does that translate? You know, do we have people that are happy, committed, fulfilled, you know, in their roles? It's not always about throwing a huge amount of money at it. It's about, again, you know, thinking also about the work environment, sort of systems there, because again, you can invest millions, you know, billions, if you like, on well-being. If fundamentally the work isn't right, there is something wrong in the system, there are systemic problems, you're wasting money. I think that, again, you know, I read this as well, you know, that wellbeing interventions don't work. And again, I think it's, I don't think it shows the full picture. Yeah. You know, there's so much more at work.
Can I ask the last?
Yeah, you can ask the final question.
It's come up a couple of times already today, like the sort of the generational aspect and sort of, you know, the changing of the guard and the way that younger generations are kind of changing their perspective, or they've got a different perspective on the value of well-being and the relationship between that and work and their life. What's this looking like for, I don't know, the 15-year-olds that are out there? You know, like, how are we educating them and supporting them to, you know, be aware that they can access talking therapies?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it's positive in the sense that we're aware of the impact that, you know, mental health has on young people, but we're still well behind in terms of that investment. In terms, I mean, it's one of the big things that we're campaigning for is school-based counselling in every school in England, which, you know, is
amazing.
It would, and I mean, I guess the economic, the social, the moral arguments for them are so strong. It makes such perfect sense, again, because again, we're talking about, you know, sort of health economics, really, and building a more resilient nation of people that have, you know, the support they need to flourish, and therefore, you know, an economy that flourishes. So it makes sense to go back to that point. Again, I'd say that we you know, there isn't enough. There are lots of, you know, again, there's lots of apps. I think we have to understand as well that younger people have, you know, a different relationship with technology. They've grown up with it. So, you know, first and foremost, that can be their first introduction, their first gateway, if you like, to, which again is fantastic, but it needs alongside it. You know, there's no cheap way to do this. It can be scalable, but I think the idea that we can replace, you know, therapy with, you know, face-to-face therapy with a human, with chatbots and whatever else is flawed, you know, argument. But
so we want, you know, not just a school nurse, but we want a school therapist as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, we've had school nurses for decades, haven't we?
Yeah,
you know,
have.
like why can't we have?
Absolutely.
Other support. Okay, amazing.
Cool.
Thanks
so much.
Yeah.
Good to chat.
Yeah, you're welcome.